One of the first segments I put on this channel back in the spring of 2019 was a clip with honey locust and black locust growing right next to each other in a park where the forest had taken over from what used to be abandoned farmland. I've got a similar habitat here today, but those trees were very large. We couldn't get a good look at the leaves or the smaller branches on those trees. So I'm going to add honey locust and black locust foliage to this channel today. What I've got here is a black locust with some shorter thorns. Got one right here next to my thumb. And it's about as long as my thumbnail, and it's covering this branch of this younger tree growing in abandoned farmland here. This is at the Heisey Park in Warren County, Ohio, and this is where you often find these black and honey locust trees growing where there's full sun and taking over what used to be a pasture. And as the forest matures, these trees kind of get shaded out, and you find your oaks and your hickories and your maples and all the other more common woodland trees. But this is often found in these parks where it's abandoned farmland. Here's our leaf. It's a pinnately compound leaf, so it has this main stem here with many leaflets. I'm not going to try to count them, but at least a dozen on most of these. And the leaflets are oval, and they're about a 1/2 to 1 inch long and about a 1/2 inch wide. So they're quite a bit larger than the tree I'm going to compare this to, which is the honey locust, which has pinnately and bipinnately compound leaves. It's got a few of each growing from its branches. But the younger branches that we can see, or the branches we can see on these trees, have different length thorns, which it makes it easier to tell them apart if there's any doubt, especially in the winter time when the other features are no longer visible. Our thorns on this honey locust branch or black locust branch are no more than 1 inch long, usually more like 3/4 of an inch long. And they do cover the younger branches. They're not as common on the older branches as opposed to the honey locust, where it has thorns on all the branches on many of the trees. So let's get back to these locusts in just a minute. I've got some honey locusts just around the corner. And here I've got a young honey locust compared to that black locust I just filmed a couple minutes ago. And as we look at these branches here, these thorns are much larger. I've got one there as large as my index finger, another one here as large as my index finger, and these branches are covered with thorns. As the tree gets older, the older part of the tree, the sap flow is no longer going to these thorns and they can break off. They're fairly brittle. They don't have the same color as the green thorns, if you want to call them green thorns. These are actually kind of a maroon color, similar color to the seed pods, which I'll show in a few minutes here. But this honey locust is growing in this old field habitat along with some red cedar here. This is at Heisey Park in Warren County, Ohio. And these thorns are much larger than the branches, than you would find on the branches of a black locust. And the leaves are quite different too. The leaves further down the branch are pinnately compound here. I'll pluck this one off here. It has got leaflets about a 1/2 inch long. I'll use my index finger for scale. They're about the size of my index finger fingernail and a 1/4 inch wide. So they're smaller than that of the black locust. And the leaflets at the end of the branches are bipinnately compound. So this tree has both. And those bipinnately compound leaves are larger and wider than the actual size of the pinnately compound leaf on the right. The leaflets are slightly smaller, probably because there are just so many of them. But this bipinnately compound leaf has many branches coming off the main stem with, at least 6 or 8 leaflets on each one. Those leaflets are probably only a 1/4 inch long on this tree, but Mother Nature's making up for it in volume, just a number of leaflets on this bipinnately compound leaf. So I think that's Mother Nature's way of putting some extra solar panels on this tree where it gets the most light. So the new growth that's closest to the sun is bipinnately compound, and as you come down the branch, most of the leaves are pinnately compound. So this tree has got both. That makes it easy to identify in the summertime, and in the wintertime, these long thorns separate it from the black locust. And it's a hot day in July, so let's continue studying this honey locust in the shade here. I'm back behind some sycamore trees here. So this is an old floodplain. We got some box elder back here, and I don't find a lot of black locusts in the areas that are very flat and poorly drained around here. It's more in the better drained soils and along roadsides and railroad tracks and road cuts. It'll grow in old strip mines if you live in Appalachia. Black locust can grow just about anywhere, and it does, and it's been introduced in many parts of the world where it actually becomes a nuisance because of how aggressive it is at taking over areas. Honey locust, the range of the honey locust is a little bit more restricted. It's basically west of the Appalachians here. It's often found along streams that aren't flooded constantly. And this is a better look at our bipinnately compound leaf here. I've got one right down here as well. So in a shady habitat, this tree isn't growing quite so fast. The leaves have filled out a little bit more, and it's easier to study them. You can see those leaflets on the bipinnately compound leaf are a little different shape than the ones that were in full sun. They're a little longer and narrower, but still no longer than that US currency dime, and maybe 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch wide. And just down the stem here are our pinnately compound leaves that look like a fern almost. And again, when they're in the shade here, they're not quite as wide. The solar panel, if you want to call it that, is not quite as wide, but it's longer actually here. These are almost 1 inch long and maybe 1/4 inch wide. So like with any other tree, there's a lot of variability, but the thorns certainly make it easier to identify in the wintertime. And the seed pods, I don't have black locust seed pods with me today. They're about the size of a redbud seed pod, which I showed a few months ago. And here's our honey locust seed pods. For scale, I've got my 3-inch long pocket knife there. So they're 9, 10, 11 inches long. They're kind of twisted. And they got some small seeds inside there. I can hear them shaking around since they've dried out from last year. This is last year's crop. They often dangle on the branches all winter long and kind of fall off as the branches start to grow in the spring. So those seeds are probably no bigger than a pumpkin seed or maybe a watermelon seed. And just for comparison, the same color seed pod is found on a Kentucky coffee tree. But the Kentucky coffee tree seed pods are thicker, and those beans inside there are about the size of that dime, and they're about the size of a coffee bean, which they were used as a coffee substitute at one time. Just a word of advice, there's a process that needs to be used to detoxify those seeds from the Kentucky coffee tree. I don't know the process, and I will not advise you as to how to do that or if you should do it, but it has been done. So that's a thicker seed pod on this Kentucky coffee tree seed pod, but a similar color. So as they hang from the branches in the wintertime, there could be a little confusion. So look at the geometry on the seed pods for the Kentucky coffee tree. It's thicker, and it's not as long, and it's not as twisted. And that would guarantee that you have the right seed pod identified. But these are our locust trees, which are common throughout the area covered by this channel for the black locust and west of the Appalachians for the honey locust.